So I always knew I wanted to be a writer. From a really young age, from a really, little itty bitty. My dad, he was my biggest inspiration. And he would read me everything, fairy tales, poems, books, comic books, cereal boxes. He read me everything. And I just loved hearing him tell me these stories, and I was always like involved and enraptured with what he was reading me. Well, one day, I don't remember how old I was, but I remember I was pretty young, and he was going to read me something, and he didn't have anything to read, so he made up a story. And he made up this story about, Goldilocks and the Three Bears. Well, there was a whole other set of bears on the other side of the forest. And this big grizzly bear, his name was Licorice. And Licorice was a bully. And he told me this whole story about Licorice and the whole lot of them. And I was like, wow, oh my gosh. I want to be a master storyteller like my dad. If he could do it, I'm going to do it. So I kind of I knew. That was my dream. As a kid growing up, I knew I wanted to be a teacher. It was about 3rd grade. I was like, yep, I'm going to be a teacher. I know it. I'm going to be a teacher. You want to know why? It wasn't because the summer's off. No, it wasn't. I wanted to write. And I knew that I would teach 10 months out of the year, and I'd be able to write for 2 months. And I was like, yes, that's great. Woo, 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 right? And then when I got to 7th grade, I was like, oh, yeah. I'm going to be a writer, because I read The Outsiders, and that got my heart. And I'm like, wow, if S.E. Hinton can do it as a teenager, I'm going to do it as a teenager. I didn't, because life doesn't go that way sometimes. But I was dead set. So life kind of takes over, high school, college. I met my husband. We bought a house in New York. We moved from New York down to Florida. I had a baby. Everything was great. Life was really, really good. But I just felt something was missing. Something was deep inside, and I'm like, yeah, I'm not, And I said to my husband, I really want to write that book. I have an idea. I've got this idea for 5 years now. I want to write it. And he said to me, so write it. Why wouldn't you just do it? And I'm like, well, I don't know, because then I got to teach, and teaching is hard, and it doesn't just end at 10 months. I mean, teaching continues on. I mean, nobody told me that. And I wish I knew. No, seriously. So he looked at me and he stopped. He goes, listen, do you hear all the words coming out your mouth? And I go, yeah. He goes, they're excuses. You're making excuses. He goes, why are you letting you get in the way of you? Novel idea. And I was like, wait a minute. Why am I letting me get in the way of me? So my daughter was about a year. And it was summertime, and I sent her off to daycare. Summer camp for 1-year-olds. Brilliant idea. For 8 weeks in the summer, I wrote. I sat down at my computer. I had this idea in my head. I was like, right, and I get it all out. Printed it all out, handed it to my husband, and I'm like, would you read it? Would you read it, hun? Because he's like, my biggest fan, right? Of course he's supposed to be. So he goes to my desk, and he takes my purple pen, the pen that I use to grade my students. Now he just flipped the switch. And I'm like, oh no, what is he doing? And he sat down on the couch with my manuscript, and he goes to town. And he goes to town. And after the end of the weekend, he read it in 2 days, and he made all corrections. He hands it back to me, and he's got this look on his face, and I'm like, well, what'd you think? And he's like, nah. That was his word, nah. And I go, what do you mean, nah? And I open it up, and I'm looking through, and the edits, the comments, there were whole pages that he took, and he went big X's down the page. I don't know what this means. My heart was crushed. He's supposed to love me. He's supposed to be my biggest fan, and now he's trashing my work. And he said to me, this is not going to get published. What, are you kidding me? Wow, that was like a gut punch. That was a super gut punch. And I'm like, oh man. So now I had 2 options. I could either give up, because I wanted to give up. I was so defeated and so deflated that I was like, all right, we're done here. I'm done. I'm not doing this. Forget it. Or I could go after my dream. And I thought about my dad. And I thought about, well, what would my dad say? My dad was my biggest inspiration. And I'm like, let's do it. So I resigned myself to making the edits. And it wasn't just edits. It was like whole plot revisions. Like, it was a big deal. It took me 6 months. So at the end of 6 months, I printed it out again, and I said, hey, do you want to read it? And I handed it to him, and he was like, all right, I'll read it. So he takes it. He goes back for that purple pen. Oh, that purple pen. He goes back for that purple pen, and he sits down, and I don't see his hand moving as I'm watching over his shoulder. So I'm like, all right. So at the end of the weekend, he hands it back to me with a smile on his face. And I was like, oh, wait a minute. Do we have something here? And he goes, yeah. He goes, this is going to get published. So it doesn't end there. So now I'm happy. Right now I'm like, woo-hoo-hoo, right? It doesn't end there. So I get online, and I'm like, all right, how do I go about getting this published? I can find a small publishing house. I can find an agent. I can, what? I start emailing everyone and everybody under the sun. Hey, I got this book. Hey, it's about elves. Hey, it's about Christmas elves. And it's really dark, and it's really twisted, and it's really scary. You want to buy it? And the response was no. 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 No, 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 no. Sorry, too dark, too twisted, too weird. Don't know who I would sell this to. One after the other, the rejection letters came in. And it was like, remember that first initial gut punch? Well, it was repeatedly, boom, boom, boom. I stopped counting at about 103 rejection letters back to me from my first manuscript. Like, I was devastated. So what did I do? I'm like, nah, I've come this far. I gotta keep going. I gotta see this through. I wanna walk into a bookstore and point at the shelf and say, I wrote that. That was my dream. I wrote that. So I'm like, all right, we're gonna put elves and Santa and all that stuff aside. What am I gonna do? What's really in my head? Zombies. So I wrote another book about zombies. And after I wrote that book, my husband, he looked at it, he edited it, he said, yeah, this is good, we're good to go. Now I start shopping that book around. And I had an agent who was interested. At the same exact time that the agent was saying, hey, would you sign with us? I had a publishing house say, oh, that book about the elves? It was in my spam folder. We want it. We want it. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like so uplifting, so like, what is happening? Two, contracts at the same time. I'm like, wow, this is happening. My dream is seriously coming true. Well, it doesn't end there. Because, listen, you don't become the big guys overnight. That was like 10 years ago. I'm still not a big guy, but I can walk into a bookstore and I can point on the shelf and I can say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I wrote that. I did that. 9 books I've published in 10 years. And I got 3 more coming out this year alone. So when you have that inside of you, when you have that spark, when you have that passion, and you're like, I need to do this. I need to fulfill this like gap in my life. You gotta go for it. Because if you don't, you never know what's gonna happen. Like you'll live the rest of your life thinking, oh, should I have? What if? What? And I don't like the what ifs. We're not going for what ifs. We're gonna make things happen. You make things happen. If you want it that bad, go for it.